Actually, Dracula has risen from an icy stream bed, which is nowhere near the place he died in the previous movie. Hi guys, so before we get into it, the usual reminder that you'll find all my other Hammer reviews in my Hammer playlist, and there will be spoilers today. This movie is 52 years old, I think, 54 years old. So this is the fourth of the Hammer Dracula films, fifth if you count Kiss of the Vampire, which I personally do, but it's entirely up to you. So at the beginning of this one, Dracula is dead and finished, but one of the nearby villages has not really been able to move on with their lives because they still feel like evil swirls around the castle. And one of the visiting priests one day is absolutely appalled to discover just how drab the atmosphere is in this village. So he drags the village priest on a little misguided adventure up to Dracula's castle to say a few magic words, put a giant cross on the door, and hopefully banish the evil permanently this time. But all they actually end up doing is reawakening Dracula, and he's absolutely pissed when he discovers that he can't get back into his castle because of the cross on the door. So he decides to get revenge on the main perpetrator of all this, i.e. the priest who was visiting from another town. So Dracula heads to this town. So for most of this movie, we're going away from the area with Dracula's castle. And what Dracula intends to do is to just make this guy's life a misery and start killing and turning all the people around him, basically. But just to go back to the start of this movie, there are a couple of continuity issues that I feel compelled to briefly talk about. So firstly, the geography of the area surrounding Dracula's castle feels very different from prior movies. I get that in long-running horror franchises, they're not always able to use the same shooting locations. If you go forward to the Friday the 13th films in the 80s, for example, Crystal Lake looks different in pretty much every film. Evil Dead 2 could not use the same cabin in the woods as Evil Dead 1. They're clearly in a different spot when they're filming. It's the same in these Dracula films, you know, and at the start of this, we get what feels like a different castle on a different kind of hill, and even the village feels different as well. But I've mentally found a way to kind of get past this, because I'm just the sort of person who does get bugged by little continuity issues. So when I'm watching this film, I pretend that the village that we see is actually on the opposite side of the castle from all the hamlets and inns that we see in the first few films. And therefore, the door where the big cross goes is actually the back door of the castle. It's all a bit weird, but it works for me. Also, as I alluded to in the prologue of the review, Dracula's resting place at the start of this is not where he died at the end of the previous movie. So at the end of Dracula Prince of Darkness, he fell into like a little frozen pond thing near his castle. At the beginning of this, he's lying halfway down the nearby hillside, frozen stiff. But I came up with a little workaround in my head for that as well. So now I picture that at the end of the third film, or fourth, if you count Kiss of the Vampire, at the end of that film, there's like a current at the bottom of that pond and like an underground stream. And I'm thinking now that maybe the body floated down that, came out of a hole in the hillside, and then froze solid, literally on the hill. It's a little bit thin, but it just kind of fixes the continuity issues at the start. So the film was directed by Freddie Francis. Not much needs to be said about that. Safe pair of hands. We've got Christopher Lee back to play Dracula for the third time. He gets a little bit more dialogue in this one, I think, than the previous one, but that absolutely works. I do think Dracula should have some lines of dialogue. There's one absolutely hilarious scene in this involving Dracula where he's on like a horse and carriage trying to get to the town where the priest is that he seeks, and the way that he's whacking this horse, it's like whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. He's doing it so fast. I've never seen anybody whack a horse as often as Dracula does in this. It's just complete cruelty, but it suits the character, but it's just so over the top. I just couldn't help laughing. We've also got Veronica Carlson playing the main Hammer glamour girl, one of the most popular Hammer girls from the late 60s. She did 3 films that were either Frankenstein or Dracula, and she also went on to do one of my favourite Peter Cushing films from the 70s, The Ghoul. She's very good in this, good actress, not just a pretty face at all. And co-starring with her in this is a guy called Barry Andrews playing Paul. Not someone I'm familiar with outside of just this one movie, although I noticed looking on his filmography that he went on to be in the James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me. I'm a massive James Bond fan, so every time I spot a Bond link in one of these Hammer films, I'm always keen to mention it. In The Spy Who Loved Me, Barry Andrews only has a small role. He plays one of the Navy guys who's involved in the big battle on Stromberg's oil tanker. It's going to be very interesting to me next time I watch that film to keep an eye out for Barry Andrews. I think I can actually picture who he might be in my mind's eye, but I guess I'll see when I come to it next. Muller is the name of the priest who comes from the different town, but it's when we get to that town that this film really kicks into gear and becomes yet another really enjoyable Dracula story. It doesn't do anything that different from what we've seen before. This is still essentially Dracula just going around turning people, and we will follow some protagonists who will hopefully slowly figure out what is going on and eventually put an end to Dracula, albeit in a very unconvincing fashion that leaves it open for a sequel. It's a good atmosphere in this town, though, and there are a lot of decent characters, 3 in fact, that deserve special mention. One of them is Paul, a very bubbly young man. I can feel the energy from him through the screen from the very first scene that he's in. It's very easy to relate to him because he's just this lowly baker, but he's secretly studying in his spare times in order to make his relationship with Maria more feasible, because she's a much higher born type of character, if you like. Maria is the Veronica Carlson character. She's not as bubbly as Paul, but she's still very likeable. It would have been very easy for her to ditch Paul about halfway through this movie and just decide that it's just not worth the effort of going out with this guy. But she's very good. She does this thing in the story where she travels between buildings using the rooftops, and I think that's one of my favourite images from this film, just Veronica Carlson slowly going over the rooftops. It's a very sexy image, even though she's wearing a lot of clothes in those scenes. She's sort of dressed a little bit like Wendy from Peter Pan in this. That's the comparison that my brain thinks of anyway. It's not the sexiest attire that she gets from the wardrobe department in this, Veronica Carlson, but I guess it just fits the character, what she's wearing. She's a very modest sort of a girl. She's not going to be showing the flesh. There's a very funny scene where Paul gets drunk and falls back on this bed, and Maria's in the room, and also a barmaid called Zena. And Zena moves to sort of unbuckle Paul's trousers to take them off to help him into bed, but Maria's like, no, don't do that. And Zena goes out of the room, and then Maria moves to do the same thing, but she can't do it. She kind of pulls her hand back as if, I'm not that comfortable about doing this. It just really struck me funny that this girl Zena, who's not Paul's girlfriend, has no qualms about taking his pants off right in front of his girlfriend, but the actual girlfriend herself is really nervous and anxious about it and doesn't want to do it when the moment comes. It's a very small thing and you can easily miss it when you're watching the movie, but I thought it was a nice little touch. Xena would actually be my third mention as a great character from this movie. This is someone who could easily have ended up being the slutty barmaid who you end up rooting against, because of the fact that she wants Paul, in her heart, she wants Maria and Paul to break up so that she and Paul can have a thing. But she's not a schemer in this regard. You know, she's not putting plans together to end their relationship. She's just someone who sort of casually leaves her hat in the ring. And if Paul wants to pick up that hat, fine. But other than that, she will stay out of the couple's way. But I really feel for this girl in the scene where she basically shouts at Dracula because she's been turned at this point and she sort of feels like she's now Dracula's girl. Okay, she couldn't have Paul, but now she's got Dracula, as dark as that is and as weird as that probably feels to her. So she can't understand it at all when Dracula instructs her to go and get Maria, because, you know, Dracula's trying to build up like a stable of girls like he had in Bride of Dracula. But it's a good bit of drama when Xena fights back, and it ends up being one of the most tragic moments in the movie when she gets flung into the fireplace, actually, because it's sort of implied that a lot of the other characters might actually survive even after they've been bitten. I certainly get that impression from Maria at the end of the film, and possibly the priest who gets bitten as well. So yeah, the Xena character is absolutely superb. It could have easily ended up being the case that you root against this girl and end up cheering when she gets thrown into the fireplace, but that's not what happens. There are some not so great characters as well. The mute church assistant, who's mostly in the film near the beginning, just absolutely terrible. If this actor actually was mute and he was just trying his best, then I hold my hands up and I take it back. But either way, he's not very good. The Monsignor, i.e. Muller, who I talked about a little bit earlier, his acting's fine, but the actual character is very hypocritical. He acts near the beginning like he's the great authority on all things evil, on anything to do with vampirism, but he ends up releasing Dracula, and later in the film he's a complete dick to Paul around the dinner table. He can't accept the fact that Paul wants to be an atheist. This film sits in an interesting position when it comes to religion. So on the one hand, it shows this ultra-religious character, Muller, being a complete dick to anyone who doesn't have the same beliefs as him. And yet, later in the film, we also see that Paul gets into quite a bit of difficulty because he doesn't have faith in the Lord. Dracula would be dead a lot quicker in this if Paul had the same religious beliefs as Muller, seemingly. So it's like the film is sort of sitting on the fence on this and saying, okay, if you want to be religious, fine, but don't be too religious to the point where you're going to start pissing people off. And the film is also saying, seemingly, if you want to be too non-religious, don't be too far that way either, because one day you might need help from the Lord that you don't fully understand, and just keep an open mind. This film has also got one of the best Dracula bites I think I've seen up to this point. There's a really sensual moment between Christopher Lee and Veronica Carlson. The way that he sort of comes into a room and hovers his face over her face for quite some time is very classily done. And there's quite a bit of tension in this scene as well, because I kept thinking, well, maybe because she's such a crucial character, there'll be intervention, somebody will come into the room and save her. Normally when Dracula gets ready to bite someone, it almost feels like a foregone conclusion. I'm glad that Maria sort of is cured by the end, though. It should be a crime to kill off Veronica Carlson in a movie. I think any director that pushes that through should be banned or struck off from the Directors Guild of America, or whatever the British equivalent would be. I've already seen Veronica Carlson die in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and I don't particularly want to see it again. I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this. So here is my Blu-ray copy of Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. Picture and audio quality on this are absolutely superb, although sadly there are no special features. This is a completely bare bones copy of the film. Some interesting cover art. Dracula has gone purple. It's like he's had some of that Willy Wonka blueberry chewing gum. Hopefully though, once this picture was taken, Dracula was rolled away to some Oompa Loompas and they were able to fix him, hopefully. Right, let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give this film. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bloody axes out of 5. I really like this film. I think it's just a cracking example of Hammer at their finest, or almost at their finest. This is Hammer at its absolute peak at the end of the 60s, producing great gothic material. And I'm very excited to check out the next Dracula film after this, which I believe is called Taste the Blood of Dracula. I think I'm right on that. Right, until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.